Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Katherine Scholes is an Australian best-selling novelist based in Hobart. Many of her novels have been set in Tanzania, the place where she was born. Some of her popular titles include Congo Dawn, The Rain Queen, The Hunter's Wife, The Stone Angel and The Lioness. She has sold over 2 million novels and her books have been translated into a number of languages. But today we're going to chat to Katherine about her new release. The Beautiful Mother, published by Penguin earlier this year, is an exquisitely told tale of one woman's experience of motherhood, what it means to be a mother, and, more fundamentally, what it means to be human. Set in a remote archaeologist's camp in Tanzania, this novel is about Essie, a young Australian woman, and the event that turns her world upside down. A fascinating exploration of some of the biggest issues we face as a species. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Katherine to the podcast today. Hi, Katherine.
Hello.
Congratulations on your stunning new book.
Thank you. It's a strange time to be publishing a book in the middle of a pandemic, but I think it's finding its way in the world, which it perhaps just in a slightly different way than usual.
After more than 50 interviews, I'm running out of interesting ways to convey how much I enjoyed reading a book. But this one was so complex, so thought-provoking and visceral. Primal, perhaps you could say. And as I said in my introduction, it made me think not only about what makes a person a mother, but what makes us human. Despite dealing with some big issues in this book, at its heart, it's one woman's story, a woman whose story mirrors your own in many ways. So I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write Essie's story?
As always, a number of different sources are there. Obviously, this is a story of a mother. It's called The Beautiful Mother, and it's about a woman who's chosen not to have children herself. She's married into a family of famous archaeologists, and they're all workaholics, the entire lot of them. And she's joined into that kind of mindset, and she's just involved in this quest to uncover the origin of the human species and how we came to be who we came to be. And so there's no room in her life or her husband's life for children. And then, through a chance encounter while she's out in the field one day, she ends up coming home with a baby in her arms that she's to look after just for the dry season, and with the coming of the rains to return the baby to the family into which she's been born. So that, of course, is going to change absolutely everything about her life. And I guess it therefore harks back to my own experience of becoming a mother, which for me too changed everything. I think every woman finds it a huge revolution emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, professionally, in every single way. I was interested in, particularly when I think of what of my own experience prompted this, I was interested in how becoming pregnant and then giving birth and then looking after a tiny little baby, newborn baby, how much it kind of threw me back into a sort of a more primal version of myself. Instincts seem to come into play, whereas I think often we've been brought up to ignore them. We have been brought up in a very rational mindset, and suddenly the emotions I felt about this little baby were not rational. They were very extreme. People would say I would kill to protect my child, and most of us luckily haven't had to prove whether we would or wouldn't. But, people are aware of these really powerful emotions and the physicality of themselves as a woman, able to conceive and bring to term another human. It just stayed with me because it's a long time since I was pregnant. My two boys are young men now. I'd always been interested in the Leakey family, who are a real-life family of archaeologists who did make some of the earliest finds and discoveries about the pre-human species living in East Africa, which is, they're our ancestors. They were working in an area called Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania since the 1930s, and about 10 years ago I visited their research base with my brother on one of my trips back to Tanzania. And so there was a bit of a synchronicity there, perhaps too, for me, the idea of writing a novel set in the place where I was born, a place that is known as the cradle of humankind because of all this evidence of the very earliest parts of our story. So on a trip back, I took the chance to go and visit the Leakey's research base, and they became the inspiration for my family, the Lawrences, and all the content in the story that is about the research that they did. But that wasn't my only connection with this interest in human species history. My husband, the filmmaker Roger Scholes, made a television series called The Human Journey about 20 years ago, and it covered this whole story of how we evolved first in Africa and then travelled up into Europe. And it was actually still under contention when he made the film, but we do now know from DNA evidence that we did all originate in Africa, and that, as you know, is one of the interesting themes in the book, because while I explore many tribes, both African tribes and European tribes, Americans, Canadians, English university people, they're a special tribe, I'm delving down to that kind of underlying humanness that we all share, and really looking at what's common to all of our stories, because we were all once Africans, we were all once black, and the history of us since then has become so complex in terms of skin colour and power imbalance, and the whole of how history has unfolded is fraught in some ways. And that's why I was interested in this story, to reach right back to before that and set that as the basis of a human story, which I guess also links into this idea of becoming a mother and having a baby. I think a lot of women for the first time really, really connect with all mothers everywhere and all babies everywhere. I think that's part of that revolution that goes on in the heart of a mother, which I look at in the book. On that same trip back to Africa that I went to Olduvai Gorge, I visited a very interesting orphanage, which was directed by a friend of mine. This orphanage was only for children whose mothers had died in childbirth, which is still tragically common in many parts of the world. Even in our society, it's a pretty dangerous day, the day that you're born. It's still an unpredictable process, and there's still tragedies. So it's also another time when we're really reminded of the kind of raw nature of being human and the vulnerability that goes with that. But these little babies were not unwanted by their families, but they had no way of being raised in the village, unless there was another mother who happened to be available to take over breastfeeding, because either their child had died or they were very well provided with nutrition and could feed too, which would be a big ask in some of those subsistence farming communities. So they would stay at this orphanage for 2 to 3 years until they were ready to eat the normal village diet, and then they would return home. And lovely part of the way this orphanage works is that a teenage girl from the extended family accompanies the baby for that whole time, which does make you smile when you think of what it must be like to run an orphanage full of toddlers and teenagers at the same time.
Yes.
Luckily, my friend, the director, was a pretty tough German lady, and she had everything pretty well organised. But wonderful place, where these little babies were kept safe and then to be returned to their families. But it did start me thinking about how vulnerable babies are in those first few years. So human babies, of course, and why that is so in evolutionary terms ever since my husband made that film, which resulted in the whole family knowing a lot about the evolution of the human species, because two reasons. One, we all had to take our part in the reenactments in the film. That was sort of somehow, well, that was somehow written in the contract in this family. I think the children had to sign before they were born, saying that they would always take part in all films, at all times, and play whatever role was given them. And strangely, in that particular film, one of those episodes, I play the part of a hunter-gatherer mother who is present at the burial of her child, and my child was all laid out and painted in ochre, mirroring the ways that real ancient, remains have been discovered, etc. So that was quite sort of poignant. But leaving that aside, the whole family became very interested and quite knowledgeable about this field, and our house ever since has been full of relics from this film shoot. Neanderthal replica skulls, stone tools, spears, skins,
Wow.
all Every book week, our children would have to find a book that was something to do with Stone Age people so that they could wear one of the costumes from the basement. So there was this knowledge already about the human story. And so I had become quite interested in the fact that, we were hunter-gatherers for 99% of our whole history. If you go back to when we first started walking on 2 feet instead of 4, which is obviously a turning point in our evolution. If you calculate it out, we've only been settled farming and then later industrial people for such a tiny period of time. So most of the qualities that we have, which is interesting when you think about mothers, most of the things that are who we are have evolved in that very long period of time when we lived in such a different way. And it is, of course, a lifestyle that I explore in great detail in The Beautiful Mother through the tribe of the Hadza people that are the last surviving hunter-gatherer people in East Africa. There's another group, the Tung people down in South Africa, who are often referred to as being, the other example, who still live pretty much as we once all did. That was fascinating for me in the book, to just study how they live, especially now with the pandemic and the feeling of vulnerability that we've all got, and people rushing around raiding supermarkets and storing their food, to know that there was once, and still is in some places, a life that just relied on the land being healthy enough to provide for all of your needs and to have virtually no possessions. And of course, the baby that causes the revolution in my character Essie's life, baby Mara, she's a child of the Hadza tribe. And so it was totally apt that my character, who had been obsessed with academic knowledge about ancient peoples, should actually find herself falling in love with and being transformed by the child of this very ancient lineage of people. And the thing that is strongest for me, and almost of all the things that come out in the book, when I say come out, there's that funny sense with a novelist that it's not entirely what you decided to put there. It seems to take on a life of its own, and then it gels, and suddenly it's itself, and you don't feel totally that you've put all the bits in a row and in a kind of intellectual way and made it work. It's just far more mysterious than that. I saw how my character might have been in the role of the great white rescuer. She's going to rescue this baby and save its life. But really, we see how the richness and the giving flows back the other way. And she learns so much from the Hadza people, and she learns so much from this baby, and learns so much from the slowing down that goes with having a baby. I mean, it's an incredibly busy and fraught time looking after a little baby, but at the same time also you have to slow down. Digging in a sandpit with a toddler is a slow, mindful process, Essie learns while caring for this little one that to be able to be in the land and not to be trying to do research all the time and quantify and calculate and map and make notes on everything. She learns how to just be. I think a lot of people have learned that from the experience of becoming a mother or a parent.
It's such a humbling experience being a parent, isn't it? Because suddenly your needs are no longer important. It's the needs of the child that surpasses everything.
Yes, it's a miraculous process. Our culture perhaps raises us to be quite egocentric. You watch people change completely, don't you? Not only yourself, but other women that you know.
I really want to just talk a little bit more about the Hadza tribe. We've all heard the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, but I think your description of the Hadza community in this book really highlights the deficiencies of Western notions of child rearing, I think. We say it takes a village, but at the end of the day, child rearing is by and large the responsibility of the two people who bring the child into their family, either by birth or adoption. But in the Hadza way of seeing things, they see a child as everyone's responsibility, which is essentially why Essie ends up in the situation she does.
Yes, that's right. They don't consider it unreasonable to ask her to do her bit. She's another human.
She needs looking after.
She needs looking after. I mean, they are, of course, quite desperate about this baby because they have to move for the dry season, and they're now getting short of nutrition, and a baby's life is at stake. But the intriguing thing about the Hadza is that they are completely egalitarian. So Men and women are equal. Children are treated with a lot of respect. They don't have such a hierarchical view. They don't have complicated religious structures that are based around power. They have strong spirituality, but they don't have that kind of organised hierarchical religion as such. They've never paid taxes. They don't have a chief of the village, it's not a village, of the family. So everybody's just a person in that group. And little babies obviously have a close connection with their mothers while they're being breastfed, which would probably go on really until another baby was born. So for a couple of years they would be fed by the mother. But after they're weaned, they say that if you wander into a Hadza camp, you won't be able to tell which baby belongs to which parent, whether male or female, because it really is a communal thing. I think that we were all like the Hadza once, but even earlier in our history as people who live in houses and are settled in one place, which was revolutionary. It changed everything about the way humans lived and ran their families, etc. And we did used to have more of a blood tribe around once than we do now. We do see how isolated our society can leave parents in a very isolated and vulnerable place. It is one of the things that this novel explores is, what different ways could life be played out.
Essie risks so much to look after baby Mara. She risks a career that she's worked long and hard for, the love of her husband, her family, everything that she thinks makes her who she is, and yet she doesn't hesitate. What do you think that says about our instincts as women?
I think we respond very much to the vulnerability of a baby, and I think that's evolved in us as an incredibly powerful force. No other mammals are so helpless for so long as humans, and the reason is very interesting and straightforward. Once we stopped walking around on four legs and stood up, our skeleton changed and our pelvis changed, and childbirth became difficult and painful, obviously, and dangerous in some cases. The baby's head, meanwhile, as a species, our brains were growing because we were thinking more. Human babies have to be born when they're born, otherwise they wouldn't be able to exit through the pelvis. They just would not be able to be born. But they are born, you might say, probably a couple of years premature, and probably we should have had a much longer gestation like an elephant. So they're born really before they're ready to take on the world. So therefore, only the children whose mothers were able to rise to the challenge of that degree of care survived and added their genes to the pool. And because gradually we evolved with a very, very strong impulse in caregivers to look after little tiny baby children. Essie originally sets out thinking, well, she'll keep this little baby firmly in its place. It'll sleep in the nursery. And she's got this ridiculous manual of childcare that's come, well, it's not ridiculous, but it's ridiculous in her world, that you've got to put the baby to sleep at certain times and must eat certain things and be dressed in a certain way. And this is the form of mothering going by the book because she's a scientist. You get a manual, you don't just do things because you think of them, you study them, get the information, proceed. And then she, of course, discovers that no, there's a little person here. And this great love affair begins, the one that we're so familiar with. And it just rolls everything out of the way. And the protectiveness is there. And because her mother-in-law, I have to just pause for a minute about the mother-in-law because I loved writing about the mother-in-law character. I think she's one of the most interesting characters I've ever created, and we can't go into spoilers, but she does change. But at the beginning, she's just so controlling and passive-aggressive and damaged. Clearly, we know early that she's got a tragedy in her past that's really contained her. So this is a story where she has travelling to do emotionally as well. But she's not keen on the baby for lots of reasons. The husband even ends up doing that thing of being jealous of the baby. He's got his own demons in his past that help explain why he is who he is. But the truth is, our society, this is set in 1970, things are very different now, of course. But traditionally, if we go back to my parents' generation, not my actual parents, a lot of men had very little to do with children. They didn't change nappies. The man's work came first, always. So there are a lot of things that thankfully have changed since the setting of this particular story. Ian also has this is the husband, he also has this view that a transaction was made that agreed not to have children. He actually put this on the table before they got married. And having children for them would have changed their life a great deal, because they would have not been able to go on living in the far distant corner of Tanzania that they live in. Yeah. And there are people who make that choice, that what they want to do with their life is going to either mean that they neglect their children or don't have them. I know peers of mine who've made that choice. I could have made it myself. I was an independent filmmaker before having my first child, working with my husband. The last film we made before I got pregnant was in Ethiopia during the civil war of the 1980s. It was dangerous. There's no way you would do it if you had children. Exactly. Left at home. I can understand where Ian comes from. And when I started writing the book, I wasn't sure how he would respond to the baby. Maybe the baby would win his heart too. We'll have to leave that to the reader to discover.
Now, there's some unanswered questions about Essie's mother and her own heritage, something that Essie's never really consciously wanted to explore before the baby comes into her life. And I think it's fair to say that the Hadza understand the importance of surrounding a child with people like them, but modern society seems less inclined to place value on the importance of belonging or refining our tribe. Perhaps that's changing a bit now, but there were long periods of our history where suppression of identity was the norm. Is it part of what makes us human, do you think, that drives our need to find out where we come from?
Until quite recently in our evolution as a species, we always knew where we came from. And when I spend time in Africa, which of course I have a lot over the years since my childhood there and now returning as an adult to visit, people know who they are. You know, I was born in Wagogo land in central Tanzania, and when I go back there and our story will come out as to our family, why we're there, you know, oh, you were born here, they'll look at me, you're a child of the land, and I said, why aren't you living here? Like, what is wrong with you? You've got lost somewhere. You're living on the other side of the world. How did that even happen? And I think that a very clear sense of who you are is very strengthening, very strengthening. And when really difficult times come, people revert to the rituals of their traditions. And one of the places where you can really see that is if you look into some of the Holocaust writing and see how Jewish families who were probably went through some of the worst times as families that anybody can ever picture, they drew so much strength from their religious traditions and the breaking of the bread, the way they did things together. And you know, I think these things have become a bit lost to us, especially in a kind of post-religious world that a lot of us are in now. What I see now is that people are creating their own rituals and their own tribes. I think a lot of people are well aware that they want to give their children something more than just saying there's money, there's jobs, there's a house, there's mum, there's dad, you know. Yeah. We want to have some of those deep old stories, and I think that's one of the reasons why people are interested in Aboriginal culture, for example, because we know they were the first people of the land that we stand on in Australia. And this book does point into the direction of some of that, because Essie's mother was Tasmanian, and Essie, has cut herself off really from her family origins completely. Her mother is not a figure that she's proud of. That again leaves Essie vulnerable, leaves her vulnerable to how her father brought her up. And, you know, there's a slightly odd sense that maybe Essie is who she is because of her father's dreams more than her own. Again, there's this wonderful liberation offered by this baby that comes into her life so unexpectedly, and really gets all the cards thrown up in the air and they fall down in a new pattern.
So, Katherine, obviously you have a very rich heritage, but what is it in particular that draws you to write stories that are based in Africa?
I started with The Rain Queen was the first one, as it was 20 years or so ago. I really wanted to tell my story. I mean, I'm a migrant child. I had written already 2 novels, but I wanted to write about Africa. Partly I didn't feel brave enough to, because I'd not been there for a really long time. It was really a place of childhood memories. Second, I felt very much that as a white child born in Africa, somehow, although migrant stories were very fashionable in Australia, that somehow I wasn't. And I think that's still to some extent true as far as the establishment goes. I have a big readership, so people do connect with my story, but it's a strange story in some ways, and I wanted to explore my cultural origins. And so the first book was set on a medical mission, because my father's a doctor and my mother's an artist. And my father actually worked for Save the Children Fund doing remote area medicine, but he was based at a mission hospital, so it was a world that I was born into. And let me tell you, it is a culture in and of itself.
Yeah,
They've got
I
their
can
own,
only imagine.
they've got their own dress code, their own recipes, their own songs, their own power structures and beliefs, obviously. And I wanted to really delve into it and perhaps try and understand it. Yeah, it was me exploring my roots. That was the Rain Queen. And then I just found that world so fascinating. So partly it's about me, partly it's just that turned out to be so interesting. But I don't think I'll always just write African novels by any means. There's a lot of other things I want to write too. And my novel, The Stone Angel, set in Tasmania, that's a lot of people's favourite of my books. Everybody's got a different favourite, and The Rain Queen was definitely one. And my long-standing readers, that they love this one the best of all, which is always nice to hear, because whatever you've just done, you feel very vulnerable and protective about.
Now, Katherine, you're obviously a successful author and writer with so many books already published. What tips would you have for any aspiring writers out there? Say your top 3.
First of all, just write that book that can only be written by you. Don't get the idea that, publishers are interested in this, or this book's been popular, etc., etc. Just look at your life as a big palette, of colours, and just see what's there. For me, when I'm doing my research, if I find a little link, like with my last book set in the Congo, I discovered that when the Belgian refugees were fleeing the Congo at the time of independence due to massacres, that a trainload of them had arrived in the town where my parents lived, and that they'd brought some of these desperate people who now owned nothing home to our house, and that my older sister had given her teddy bear to one of their children. And, a tiny family anecdote. It's of no meaning really to anyone. But when I discover those tiny links with the story I'm researching, I go, yep, I've got a hold on that story. It means something to me that's part of me as well as this research that I'm doing. So I'd say, mine all that stuff, look for the links and do the story, write that thing that's only your story to tell. That's the first one. The second one, this is now a different kind of thing. Probably if I had to pick one technical thing about writing, I would just say characters must change. Principally your main characters. The more they are the main character, the more they must change. So I always keep a tab and write sort of story arcs down on paper and sort of see where people begin in the story. And it doesn't mean I know how they're going to change, it just means I'm watching their journey. I'm watching for the change and seeing how they can interconnect, because that's my third point, connectedness. It is, I think a novel is like a massive piece of knitting.
Yeah.
And if you can pick up the threads of anything that's further down in the scarf or sock or whatever it is that you're making and bring it back into the story, and I think the reader loves it. I think they love it when they go, oh yeah, because that was part of his early experience, or she once owned something like that, and so that must mean this. And they because they're gradually forming a world in their mind from what you're putting on the paper, picking up things from earlier in the book and bringing them back in are great. I'm going to do 4, because the other one is, it's always more interesting to be specific than general. So if you're writing about a dog, it's not a dog, it's a wolfhound with a missing eye, with scraggly tail, whatever.
Yeah.
If it's a car, it's not a car, it's a Volkswagen, da da da. I mean, it sounds obvious, but I still sometimes look at my work and go, that's going to be better when I pin that down a little closer to what is specific. And it doesn't just apply to objects, it applies to themes and characters and everything. So, yeah, they're my 4.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. Katherine, are you working on anything else at the moment?
Not yet. I've got a one-track mind with writing. I always work on only one thing. People will say, we've got an anthology. Have you got a short story or something in your bottom drawer? And I'm never in any anthologies, because I never have anything I can give anybody. So I will finish this. I'll finish talking about it soon. And then I will take a little holiday, pandemic restrictions allowing. I was planning to go back to Africa, and maybe things will change. Maybe I still can, but yeah. And then I'll start thinking again about what I want to do next. And in that time, all I do is collect ideas and just put them in an old-fashioned notebook too. I'm collecting, but I haven't yet even chosen a country or an idea or anything.
If listeners wanted to find out more about you and your books, where can they do that?
I've got a website, katherinescholes.com. There they can see all my books. There are a few articles in there, including one called Homecoming that describes my first return to Africa as an adult, the same trip that I just mentioned earlier with the orphanage and the visit to the Leakeys camp, and a few other articles give a little bit more. If you search me on YouTube, you'll see a few little films, including one that was just made a couple of weeks ago that really is about the beautiful mother. It hints at some of the things we've talked about today. I have a Facebook page just called Katherine Scholes, and a lot of authors don't communicate through their public Facebook page, but I do. So if people want to write to me, that's through Messenger, I'll reply.
It's been such an honour for me to have read your stunning new book, The Beautiful Mother, and to be able to chat with you. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you. And it's just lovely to be able to relax into a good long conversation, isn't it? No, I've really enjoyed it. It's been lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Listeners, for your chance to win a copy of this gorgeous book, head over to my Facebook or Instagram and follow the prompts to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.